Hi and welcome to the Neil Ashton podcast. In each episode, we explain some of the fascinating ways that science and engineering are changing the world around us. We talk to leading engineers from elite level sports like cycling and Formula One, to some of the world's top academics to understand how fluid dynamics, machine learning, supercomputing are bringing in a new era of discovery. We also hear some of their life stories, their career advice, and lessons they've learned on the way that I hope will be helpful to you too. So sit back and enjoy this episode. Hi and welcome back to the Neil Ashton podcast. We're in season 2. Wow, I'm pleased that we've managed to get through a whole season, I think 14 episodes. I'm really appreciative of the positive feedback, and so I wanted to try and do an even better job for season 2. And what's a better way than starting a new season with somebody who I think is probably at the moment one of the most influential, powerful, important figures within Formula One, and that is Nikolas Tombazis. And he is the single-seater director for the FIA. Essentially, what that means is he is the person who is responsible for setting the rules of the sport and works with his colleagues to set the discipline, the rules of the car, speaks with the teams, changes, listens to feedback. He's the one who works closely with Formula One management and all of the partners. But he is the one who is the figurehead to deal with the team principals, to deal with the technical directors, and along with his team, advance the technical and sporting regulations of Formula One. In this discussion, though, I really wanted for you to learn more about him, because I think he has a fascinating history. He's one of these people who was one of the first PhD educated people with a real sort of scientific background who went into Formula One starting in the early 90s. It's obviously very common now for that to happen, but back then it wasn't so much. And he really has gone through, the ticking the box of all the top positions in the teams. He was at Benetton, he was at Ferrari, he was at McLaren. He's won multiple world championships, and has someone who really has probably one of the best understandings of the sport from a technical side, and obviously now from a regulatory side. So we cover lots of areas. He's somebody who I really like his personality. We worked together a little bit when I was doing some stuff with Formula One for the new rules, about 4 years ago, and at a time he was a consultant there before he took over at the FIA. And he was one of these people I had on my list to speak to before we, when I was starting to do this podcast. So I was really pleased, and I think if you're a fan of Formula One or not, I hope you'll appreciate the topic and the discussions we go through and hearing about his fascinating life journey. So yeah, sit back and please enjoy this episode with Nikolas Tombazis. You went to Cambridge University, but when did you know that you were going to do engineering versus, let's say, physics or maths? Specifically, what made you want to go into an engineering course?
I guess I was very interested in mathematics and physics primarily at school. And I also always had a bit of a design background because my father was an architect, and so there was always some form of drawing going on at home. And I was extremely passionate about Formula One. And my aspiration was to be designing Formula One cars as a kid. And all of those factors, I think, conspired to make me want to go into engineering. I was also quite, maybe a bit arrogant as a youth. Maybe I still am. And and therefore I didn't want to do what my dad did. I felt it would be too easy in some ways, even though I have full respect for the profession of architecture, and I find it fascinating. I had too many people, I guess, when I was a kid asking me, are you going to be an architect when you grow up? And that probably created the opposite effect in my head as a youth.
It's kind of amazing, isn't it, how those reverse psychology, or some people, so you never know. If you say to someone, don't do that, sometimes it can drive them the other way. So you're always into football. Were you one of these people then as a teenager that had that laser focus for Formula One, was watching the races, was really passionate about it?
Yeah, I guess I got hooked up to Formula One when I was about 10 years old. That's when I watched my first races. And when I was then, in Greece, where I come from, there was not always TV coverage. There was only a few races a year. Mm-hmm. But I was always waiting for the newspaper or the evening news to see who had won a race and following and so on. And back then, of course, there was a lot of talk about ground effect because the Lotus 79 was dominating in 1978, and then in 1979 it was all very much an aerodynamic war between competitors, and there was a lot of drawings in magazines with diffusers and arrows indicating where to move and so on, and all of that intrigued me very much, and that's what really attracted me. I used to have, I still have that my best friend from school in those days, and he was also extremely passionate. He didn't become an engineer in Formula One, but we used to have to draw our own Formula One cars and try to compare them and say why mine is better than his or his better than mine, or whatever. So we used to draw cars a lot back then.
Yeah, that's. I guess you would be the equivalent now of those people who can draw. Have you seen them online where they draw in CAD an almost exact F1 car? They're not Formula One designers, but they just have incredible CAD skills that they draw these things. I guess maybe.
No, well, clearly no CAD back those.
Yeah.
Indeed, not even a computer. No, I would just draw side view, plan view, and a cross section of the diffuser and a few things like that. But yeah, I guess if CAD had been available, then probably would have loved to.
Yeah. What was Cambridge like then? Was that quite a culture shock going to, I can imagine, what feels like being in the 16th century? Was that something you enjoyed, that you were sort of excited about?
Well, I was very excited to go there, and I have to say, I definitely enjoyed it. It was probably the most careless period of my life in many ways. I was doing something I enjoyed. I didn't have to do subjects that I did not enjoy, like at school. There were some subjects I did not enjoy that I had to do being at school, whereas at Cambridge, you just did engineering, which almost everything I enjoyed. It was first period away from home and parties and living with other young people, in close proximity. Yeah, it was quite reasonably hard work, but I wouldn't, compared to other stuff I've had to do in my life, it was probably quite, and with hindsight, yeah, it was definitely the easiest period of my life. Yeah.
I know, I always think this, I don't know if you ever look back and, well, not regret is the wrong word, but you do fully appreciate university. I think it's that sweet spot, because you're right, at school, you have no freedom, really. you're kind of told what to do. You have to do the things.
Yeah.
You're in a work scenario when you're in your early 20s and you're kind of told what to do normally, especially nowadays. University, I guess, is that sweet spot where you have enough freedom. Usually they kind of say, well, if you don't want to go to lecture, well, fine, whatever.
Yeah.
It is a freeing period, isn't it?
It is, yes. And again, you're 18, you're away from home, you don't have to ask permission to do almost anything.
Yeah.
And you're doing stuff you enjoy. I must say, when I was there, I felt quite shocked by some of the professors who, sometimes you get to speak with a professor who was maybe 70 years old or something like that. And you'd ask him where he'd been to college, and he'd say, well, I've been to Cambridge, and I did my PhD at Cambridge, and then I became a fellow, and then I studied.
Yeah.
And so there's these guys who've lived there for like 50 years. And that one, I must say, did not attract me. I'm still happy I haven't stayed there for 50 years. But I can see why some people have done that as well.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true. That's sort of, I've met a few professors who don't drive because they've always lived in college accommodation. Yeah. And probably similar to you, it's like this, and they just cycle around the town. It's almost like watching an Inspector Morse or one of these programs,
Yeah, and live in a bubble, don't they? And some of them have never moved away from that bubble. I have to say, obviously, life has its trials and tribulations, and maybe they've understood things much better than we have.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, it's not such a bad lifestyle. But one thing that intrigued me is, especially when you did it, a lot of people who are really into engineering, or even fast forward to now, really are desperate to get into Formula One. The first chance they have, they'll try and go. You went and did a PhD. I'm just wondering what drove your decision. Was it a quest just for more knowledge? Was it a strategic thing of doing it? What was the reason that you then went to go down the PhD route?
Well, first of all, I will say, conscious that we're talking about whatever now, sort of 35 years ago or whatever, that I fully acknowledge that things may have changed since then, and what was a decision back in the 80s or 90s isn't. I do not imply that this is.
Yeah.
I didn't feel at the time that just a 3-year degree was enough in some ways. In many other countries, 3-year degree would be associated with, lesser studies of some sort.
True.
So I had one was that in my mind. So I guess I always had in mind that I was going to do some form of postgraduate study. I had heard that Imperial College, where I went for my PhD, had sort of quite a few people had gone into Formula One from there back then, and I felt that was going to be putting me in a good position. I also felt that maybe the amount of aerodynamics I had done at Cambridge was not that much. I mean, I had taken all the aerodynamic options I could, but I felt I could do a bit more. So it was pretty. I didn't actually even try to go from Cambridge into the Formula One team back then. I only started looking for a job in Formula One during my PhD, during the latter part of my PhD, more accurately.
And what was the focus of your PhD in the end? What was the main?
It was experimental aerodynamics. So I was working in a wind tunnel, and I was studying the wakes of bluff bodies and the vortex shedding, and how the various 3D effects that occur naturally, and I guess what I got from the PhD was not the actually knowledge of the vortex shedding from bluff bodies. That, honestly, you can read it up. And okay, I guess what I got from it was that I had to do a big project which was standalone. It was, I had to deal with a lot of issues, whether it was instrumentation or writing software back then to analyze my data, or designing my models or instruments that I would put in the wind tunnel, sorting out basically everything, and having to then think a bit like try to provide some original theory of trying to explain what you're seeing and to understand what it is you need to do in order to investigate it. So for me, it was more the process of the thinking process, or learning the thinking process, more than the actual specific topic I was studying. That I felt was neither here nor there.
No, I totally agree with you. I don't think your conclusion is entirely wrong about the 3-year thing. I know when I speak to a lot of my sort of European colleagues that, the 4 or 5 year standard degree or masters, or rather, let's put it around the other way. People who do end up going into a PhD from a UK background sometimes struggle a little bit in the first year because they haven't had the same amount of knowledge as people who have done longer degrees. But the other way works as well, that if you were to leave after just 3 years, you wouldn't have necessarily had the same length of study time and individual projects and things like that. So I think that still holds true today, at least in my opinion. And you were probably, would you not say, one of the few, there was far less people, I would say, having a PhD going into Formula One in the early 90s compared to now? Was that the case? When you went to Benetton, were you one of the few people who had done a PhD, or was it actually already quite common?
In Benetton, I think there was very few. Maybe it was me and one other guy in, I remember, structural mechanics, I think. I don't think there was anybody else there. And back then, of course, there was a lot more people who'd grown through the ranks and maybe been mechanics in their youth or whatever, and as well as quite a few engineers, of course. In aerodynamics, obviously aerodynamics in the, let's say, in the 80s or even the late 70s during the Colin Chapman, whatever, the period I described as a kid, aerodynamics there were evolving very much empirically, and I don't think people who did it really had that much knowledge about aerodynamics. So there were people who were quite successful aerodynamicists back then who actually had very little formal knowledge of aerodynamics. I think when I arrived in the scene in the 90s, it was beginning to be more accepted that people needed to actually have understood aerodynamics a bit better. And certainly there were a few other people also from Imperial College who had gone into Formula One back then. The big difference to now, of course, is that when I arrived at Benetton, I was the second aerodynamicist.
Crazy.
So basically my boss was head of aerodynamics and me as junior aerodynamicist. And most teams had 2 or 3 or maybe 4 aerodynamicists, the bigger teams. And as a consequence, and maybe the small teams had maybe 1 aerodynamicist. And as a consequence, the opportunities to enter Formula One were much fewer back then. I felt it was a double-edged sword because nowadays I think people enter, I think it's probably a bit easier to enter now. There's still a lot of competition, quite hard, needs hard work. But their career progression afterwards is a bit slower, because a lot slower. It's unthinkable for somebody to be, I don't know, chief aerodynamicist at 26. I was chief aerodynamicist.
Yeah, I was going to get on to this.
I mean, nowadays, I think if they're lucky and very capable, they will be maybe at that sort of position at 35 or something like that. So I think it was arguably more difficult to enter back then. But once you entered, I think if you had some sort of level of competence, I guess your progression was a bit more rapid. And I remember back then even I had this feeling for the generation of engineers who were in Formula One since the 70s. They were all sort of chief designers, technical directors. They had designed everything from nose to tail, and they had I felt that for many years there was quite a gap in Formula One, because there were these divine heroes in my perception from the 70s who knew how to do the whole car, and all the young people like me or other people arriving didn't have exposure to the whole car, and it was difficult to see how they're going to expand one day and so on. Clearly, I guess biology contributes to that, because you get tired or went too old to work, and then you had to step in.
Yeah. That is... so you went from Imperial, so you went to Benetton. Was Benetton... Where was it? Was it in Enstone by that time? Or was it...
Yes, I think... when I started working, which was end of 92, they had moved to Enstone. Literally probably a month previously or something like that. It was very new. And my interview to be accepted at Benetton was done at a previous factory, and then when I started working, it was a new one.
What was it like at a personal level? Because you were in Cambridge, then I guess in London, and then you were coming out. Did you have a bit of a shock moving to this Oxfordshire countryside, Cotswolds, from the sort of big city of London? Was that sort of a big move?
From a personal side, I guess a bit, but I was obviously a lot younger than I am now, and I had quite a lot of stamina, and all my social life remained in London.
Okay.
I found a house in a place called Wheatley, which is quite close to Oxford, but close to the M40, so I could easily get into London within about 50 minutes. There was fewer speed cameras back then, and I was about 20 minutes from work, and I would go to London almost every weekend.
Okay.
And usually I'd probably go into London probably once midweek as well, and to meet with friends and stuff like that. And of course we had the wind tunnel. We were using a wind tunnel at Farnborough back then, which was also a bit closer to London still. I never had any real social life in Oxford or in that area. All my life was in London.
Which is, I always find this a little bit unusual, and I know there's some historical reasons for it, that these F1 teams, other than a couple of exceptions, are all within this 40-50 mile radius of each other. Do you find that and when I speak to some younger people, they hate it because they're like, oh God, I'm moving out to the countryside. There's just these old pubs around, hence why you went to London, and I think others sometimes want to be close to a city. It does create a weird dynamic though, doesn't it? It all being in just this one part of the world, do you not think?
Yeah, I mean, it's understandable technically why this is the case, because obviously these teams indirectly and unwillingly sort of collaborate with each other to some degree by nicking each other's personnel.
That's exactly what I was alluding to, that I guess as you can just jump to another team and still stay living in the same place.
When I found my house, I chose it strategically. I bought a small flat back then when I got my job after a few months, that I thought, well, it is close to Oxford. If you look at where the teams are, Benetton, the various other Formula One teams. Williams was a bit south of Oxford back then, and so on. So I felt I was covering a reasonably good circle. Of course, then I moved to Italy afterwards. My plan quite so I had to sell my house. But yeah, initially I thought, it's quite a strategic choice. But in the end, well, life came about differently.
Yeah, to the point that if I go to a pub in Woodstock or somewhere, I'm always surprised how often you'll see somebody, and I think it's probably best not to. It'd be hard to have a secret meeting, when people are deciding to move teams, because you'd have to pick a pub that no one else is going to go into. I'm sure there's been some conversations overheard for sure. So you were, that was incredible. You joined in 92, and then by 94, you were essentially the head of aerodynamics or the chief aerodynamicist.
Yeah, it was the latter part of 94. So 2 years after I joined, I guess I was a chief aero. Yeah.
Actually, that's almost unbelievable. Now people never become head of aero, or they're 15 years and still trying. How was that? Were you always used to leadership positions? I know it sounds a strange way. Were you comfortable in that sort of responsibility?
Yeah, I don't think. I'm not saying I'm good or not good at leadership positions, but I didn't have a. I enjoyed what I was doing very much. I was a very hard worker. It was a passion for me as well as a profession. So, and I think I was half decent. So all of that was okay. I always felt that people who are cutting up patients on a surgery table or something like that have more responsibility than I had in many ways. So what I mean is maybe less publicity, but still, I think ultimately, I always felt, yes, it is a lot of responsibility, but we are still doing sport or something pastime almost for a lot of people. So it doesn't mean I never use that as an excuse to somebody say, well, don't worry, we to my boss. But I always felt that ultimately we are still doing something that is fun and so on.
Yeah. What was it like though going to that first few days at Benetton? Because as someone who was really into Formula One, that first few days of being in it, was it everything you hoped it to be? Was it a bit less? What was the feeling like those first time in F1?
Driving up those country lanes on morning of day one, and of course that was pre-GPS, and I was trying to find my way around.
Yeah.
And I remember driving and thinking, now finally I'm going to learn the truth. I'm going to ask all the questions for why this is done in this way or that way, and why is the car shaped in that particular way, why is this particular solution adopted, and so on. And so I remember asking when I arrived, the first day I went to the wind tunnel and say, why is this like that, why is that like that? And I got a lot of answers along the lines of, we've tried 10 shapes and this is the best one. And I've got no idea why this works. So I guess my imagination of perfection was damped very, very quickly. And people nowadays, I think, struggle a bit to understand it, because nowadays you have such near perfect simulations that people can see the flow, can see almost every little vortex, every little eddy or something like that. Uh, Whereas back then, of course, we didn't have that, and therefore to understand what the flow is doing was extremely difficult. And the knowledge of people of the previous generation that hadn't followed as much aerodynamic studies, and therefore a lot of it was empirical. So my dream was shattered quite early. Not my enthusiasm, but I mean, and I also realized very quickly that it's very difficult. That you still need a lot of empirical approach, even if you've done a PhD. It's not your PhD doesn't immediately tell you what shape to do or anything like that. So you still have to spend a lot of time understanding things.
I must admit, I had that reaction when I went into F1, and I think I've seen others, that the problem with doing a PhD in a way is that you have become an expert in your area. You become almost a little bit opinionated because you've been a sole person working. And sometimes the temptation is to go in from academia to industry and instantly question, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And, but conversely, I found that practical pragmatism is something that is just almost essential within industry, isn't it? There's a certain amount of this thing that, the ideal world is in academia, but if you only live in that academic world, you don't really see how things are really done in industry. And that's what I personally have found. People who go into industry do see a more rounded view of sort of design in the world. Maybe different back then because they didn't have some of the simulation approaches. But yeah, I can see where you're coming from.
Well, as I say, what I was not impressed with on day one was the level of aerodynamic understanding. I felt was a bit low. But what I was, on the other hand, impressed with was the very intense program and the empirical approach and getting the job done. And that very much compensated. And for sure, if somebody arrived on a high horse and said, this is what the theory says, one wouldn't be successful. One had to do a lot of empirical things. And I have to say, in a bizarre way, my PhD, because that was your previous question, helped me, because in my PhD I had to design my experimental apparatus, I had to design my traversing gear, to write little bits of software to analyze data, to take algorithms and fit them into my programs to do, Fourier transforms and stuff like that. So all of these things I felt were extremely useful to my first years at work, probably more than the actual knowledge I learned about vortices and bluff bodies.
Yeah, no, I can see exactly. And I guess at that time as well, because there were so few aerodynamicists, you had a bigger impact.
Yeah.
But, potentially, and you were driving the change. One question I did have is, back in that time, you were probably, I guess, at the crucial starting point of when CFD. When did CFD start to be used? Was it in those early 90s, or was it when you moved to Ferrari that it was really more predominantly used?
I was tasked with starting the Benetton CFD program.
Ah, okay.
And I did quite a lot of work there. To say that CFD work I did actually benefited the car would be probably quite wrong. I think I was very little, if anything at all, which was CFD originated and so on. I learned a lot about CFD and about why things are more complicated in CFD. So I think that benefited me in later stages of my career, when I was in more senior roles in Ferrari and so on. But initially, I remember I was doing 2D simulations for wings. Very soon realized that was pretty hopeless. And and I was writing some routines to change wing shapes and stuff like that and try to optimize. But basically, I didn't have a package that would tell me whether design A is better than design B in a reliable way. So that was pretty hopeless. I guess back in the 90s, and I was using the, how do you call it, the ancestor of Fluent. It was a package called Rampant.
Yeah.
It was done by, I think the company was called Fluent, but the package was called Rampant initially. Then I felt at that time, and that was a common phenomenon in the 90s, that people who were doing CFD felt they were a bit too cut out from the real action, and they would not be, they were the like boffins on the side, and felt they were too detached. So everyone back then, also happened to me in Ferrari when I was in a senior position, people doing CFD would come to me and say, no, I want to do wind tunnel work back then. So yes, back then, I guess the most useful CFD process back then were panel methods. Panel methods were numerically, of course, a lot less dense. You could design reasonably well 3D shapes on wings, like front wings. And we started doing some panel methods. Then I was promoted to chief aerodynamicist in late 94, so I moved much more, my focus was much more onto the wind tunnel and so on.
Okay, and is it, which would you say has advanced the most from a practical making a car? Do you think it's the wind tunnel technology since the 90s or the CFD technology?
I would say the CFD by probably quite a considerable factor. I mean, CFD has multiplied by, I don't know, hundreds, if not thousands of times of usefulness, whereas wind tunnel was pretty useful back then.
Yeah.
It was still very useful. Clearly, technology is evolved massively, but the basics are extremely similar. Whereas back then, CFD, like back then, was like an abacus almost.
And what do you? I mean, this is jumping forward a little bit, but just while we're on the topic, I remember there was long a discussion. This particularly during the sort of Manor period in the Virgin teams, or there was some of these challengers who tried to do more of a CFD only approach, and obviously now there is a lot more topical discussions around the role of wind tunnels and CFD. Do you see a future where CFD, could be the only or the predominant design tool, or do you see that there is a role for wind tunnels and experimental methods almost always in this sport?
Well, it depends. First of all, if you talk by the team's free choice or by regulation, of course. Depends which way your question is. I guess the prospect of CFD being the only development tool, I believe is becoming quite realistic. I think you will always need to have a very strong correlation forum, and I believe that therefore to have a periodic correlation opportunity, I think, will always be necessary, because you can't expect just to do CFD and to get a bad surprise when you arrive at the track, so you will need some form of correlation. I think that is a realistic prospect, that it could happen. You mentioned Virgin, and back then I was, when they were making a lot of noise about, actually we're going to do it all in CFD, I felt it was pretty naive. I, however, was thinking back then we were worrying a lot about, I don't know, curved flows. If you go many years further back in the mid-90s, I believe at Benetton we were probably the first to do serious work in yaw and roll of the car and steer. We were the first to go away from the straight ahead to yaw and found that the car was losing so much performance that we had to develop a lot there. I think that was a trend that then subsequently got copied by everybody. But back in the sort of mid-2000s and late 2000s, we were worried about a lot more about wheel shapes and tires and tire deformations and hot flows, curved flows, all sorts of parameters of this sort of nature that clearly could not be simulated in the wind tunnel properly. And therefore, I remember thinking, well, maybe they have correlation issues, but at least they can simulate the full, the full Monty. Only to find out when I did my brief stint at Manor that actually the Virgin, they were running just half a car in straight ahead. So therefore, I think they had the worst of both worlds. They had just a straight ahead condition to the best, to what I've been told. I never saw any data, but somebody told me that was what they were doing, and not having the correlation. And clearly, I think they had underestimated the difficulties that are posed by open wheels.
But how, I mean, obviously I'm a CFD person. I'm quite biased in wanting to see more CFD, but then equally I can understand an argument of, well, how does it make the sport better? How do you balance? And then the other argument is, well, F1 should be the pinnacle of technical, and we need to be pushing all things forward, like CFD and other things. How do you balance in your head this thing between it's a sport, it's all about just how exciting the racing is, versus upholding the Formula One is the pinnacle of engineering, it's trying to be always using the latest methods, that's why companies want to sponsor it. How do you balance those two?
That's a very good question and a very difficult one. It's a very, very fine balance because we do have, obviously, we do rely on public watching us, and the main client of Formula One is the fan on the grandstand, and they must watch an exciting race, an exciting championship. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes less so. I think fans don't want to see Formula One become like a one-make series. I think they are interested in the fact that it is a Ferrari fighting against a Red Bull, against a Mercedes, against a McLaren, etc., etc. Therefore, there has to be a competition for technological stuff. And at the same time, Formula One needs to be pure. When I say pure, I mean we don't want to have, let's say, balance of performance of some sort, try to handicap the fast car or something like that, and fair in that respect. And also, we need to reduce costs. And in the last period, we also have an obligation to remain relevant from an environmental point of view, and so on. All of these key targets, entertainment, technological, environmental, cost, sustainability in that respect, all of these are mutually incompatible to some degree. So as any, mutually incompatible set of equations with too many unknowns with too few equations, and vice versa, and too many equations with too few unknowns. The solution is always, let's say, what one perceives to be a best fit. It's not it cannot be too much in one direction or the other. And that is a very difficult part. We have, in my current role, us in the FA as really having, let's say, an agenda to protect the sport as much as possible and to make it grow and to keep it, to achieve those objectives. We have the team participants, team principals, for example, the bosses of the teams, who also love the sport and want to be healthy, but they also at the same time they want to win. And they, in the discussion, they look at both. They look whether this particular rule is going to benefit my team more than their team, but they also look at whether the sport is going to grow. Then you go into discussions with, say, engineers who also look at the interest of the sport, and it's all very legitimate, but every participant and every stakeholder in these discussions has a slightly different angle to why they believe a sport should go in a particular direction or other. We can't make it just a playground for who's designing a car. It can't be just a playground for an aerodynamicist, for example, or an engine designer or anything. But also, it cannot be one make. There's a middle ground somewhere that tries to identify the correct areas where we want to have competition, and to what extent that wants to be, and areas where we don't want to have competition, maybe, and so on. And clearly, we always want to keep the driver very, a key part of the competition, because ultimately the fans want to see humans racing against humans.
I am still amazed when I have some friends message me who are really into Formula One, and they love the intrigue about the engineering stuff. It is one of the things of F1, isn't it, that people, even if they don't fully understand it, and there's probably very few people who truly understand what's put on the car and the real reason, there's a lot of people who write about it, but a lot of people don't actually understand it. But it doesn't matter, because they love the intrigue, don't they? Oh, have you seen the new rear wing of that car? It is almost part of the sport, isn't it? This technical...
Yes. Although we need to be very conscious that if it was just that, and no entertainment, then we'd be all looking for another job.
Yeah, and probably maybe we're all a little bit in our own bubble, because probably most people we speak to are engineers, and they're the ones.
There are a lot of people who don't understand any of that, even avid fans. And some years ago, when we were discussing some regulation changes, there were some team principals who said, that's going to make all cars look very similar to each other. And I remember somebody did a rendering of the previous generation cars, all in white.
Oh, yeah.
Asked the team principals to recognize which was their own car. In most cases, they couldn't even tell their own car apart from the others. And the reason, however, that we don't have cars that look a lot more different is not only whether the rules are more restrictive. That is one part of the reason. The other part of the reason is that I think it's very much what we've been discussing for the last 1 hour. It's the level of simulation. The amount of simulation you do nowadays, there's no way you would design a car with 6 wheels, even if it was permitted, if it wasn't much better, or if it wasn't clearly better in simulation, or indeed, if it was better, probably there would be 10 cars of 6 wheels. Suddenly there would be a rule saying, well, actually, you must have 4 wheels. But what I mean is, there's no way you would design something that is so far out of the ordinary, with a high nose or low nose, or completely different, double diffusers, or all of these either successful or unsuccessful things of the past. nowadays the level of simulation is so fantastic that you can't just use your gut feeling anymore, or your instinct, or some sound knowledge, but you just need to simulate, and a lot less is left to chance nowadays.
Which leads then on to the, I guess, logical question of AI. In a lot of industries, there have been breakthroughs in drug discovery, weather forecasting, where with sufficient amount of prior data, machine learning models have been trained and shown to actually give as good or faster, predictions. Is this something that you sort of see as almost a natural evolution, just a CFD help wind tunnel thing, or is there sort of you have to be careful that you don't have a team that's blasting money on training AI models and, as you said, able just to automatically design a car almost. Where do you see that future going when it comes to AI in the sport?
Well, I think it's unavoidable. It will be playing a more and more dominant role in this sport. I don't think the clock can go backwards in that respect. There's a lot of things which happen, which are an indication of progress, not only in the sport but in life in general, which in many ways have made life better in a particular way, but have made life less fun than it used to be, and so on. And but many times you can't go back. I'm pretty clear in my head that kids having computer games and Game Boys and online games is a lot less fun overall than playing in the woods and building houses out in the garden. And I think it is a bit. And my kids are now old enough that I don't have to have this concern, but I went moral dilemma about whether they should get a Game Boy or a computer game or something like that. But at some point it became impossible to resist the tide of that thing happening. And I think the same applies to what we've been discussing about simulation. Simulation has removed a lot of the intuitive or sexy part of creating something different, and AI has, I think, a similar connotation, I guess. I don't think these things are things that can go back, really.
I get, yeah. So I guess for you more, it's more just how you manage it and make sure that teams, because I guess the challenge you always have is you're not dealing with and this is meant to be offensive to the team, you're dealing with incredibly competitive people and teams who won't stop just for the sort of moral or ethical reason, but will go to the rules, essentially. That seems my impression of the sport. It's like any other sports. People are so passionate that they will just go up to the line. I guess the difficulty for you as an organization is just how you frame it in a way to protect from the excesses that they may do.
Yeah, I think that will be evolving in the next few years. Clearly, we are also going to be using more and more AI for policing and for detecting breaches and so on and so forth. So it's a bit on both sides, I guess.
Yeah, it's a battle of the two. One question, you're in a unique place to maybe answer this. People always wonder, what do you think is the reason you have a team, let's say Mercedes, or it could be McLaren in the past, it doesn't really matter, who have been going really well, had a great car, won world championships. And then the next year, usually I guess because of a rule change, but not always, they then start to do really poorly. Is it? But they have the same people sometimes. Does it suggest that Formula One, whilst there's lots of simulation, is just such a complex thing that people truly have still not really understood how to design a Formula One car, and so there's so many risks that you can just go off the wrong path? Why is it that they can suddenly go from great to terrible? Do you know some?
Well, first of all, I'd rather not speak specifically about.
Let's say generic F1.
I've lived in a similar. Actually, I've lived similar experiences as working for a team when it's been winning at one time and then doing badly at another time.
Yeah.
I guess. Well, first of all, the gaps nowadays are very small, and therefore, what you call doing terribly is maybe 3 or 4 tenths of a second per lap. As you say, there's usually quite a lot of accumulated knowledge that is difficult to undo, and sometimes a rule change contributes to that, being nullified and then almost people starting again. It's extremely difficult to not become complacent, I think, if you're winning. People do become complacent by nature. I find that myself as well. It's it's more easy to underestimate sometimes the task at hand. So I think it's all of these factors that can contribute.
Well, how much? This is my theory. I'm interested to know if you agree with this. A people thing. How much do you think of it is ultimately this wave of people? So somebody gets lured away to another team. By the fact that somebody else goes to another team, somebody else replaces them. Maybe the people below didn't like that they got replaced. That causes some bad thing. And then the other person leaves. Like, how much do you think of this weird thing? Is this, going back to the earlier question, of all the teams being so close, they jump around. How much do you think this is ultimately like a people thing less than a technology, and that who you have as your leader can actually make a genuine difference because of the potential for people to move around? And
I think I would tend to agree. I think the people thing is very much part of it, and I mentioned it as complacency, but complacency involves a team maybe stagnating, and but on the other hand, it could be that you lose 2 or 3 key personnel, then the new people, working together don't quite manage to click together properly, and so on. I remember when I was, I'm digressing a bit, but when I was at Ferrari, I was chief designer in that period. We won 2 championships in 2007, 2008. And I was feeling particularly chuffed about that.
I can bet.
And we had the company had organized for some of the senior managers some sort of leadership training and type thing, and they were, and I remember doing these sessions with all my group, like my senior people in my group, and there was about 7 or 8 of us, and I remember they gave us a task to do. It was like a bit of a role play type game type task where you had to produce an outcome. And I remember we sat down very much like we'd do in a meeting, and we said, okay, now what's the task? Let's do X, Y, Z, and so on. These things that some people were given as tasks are less important. These things are more important. Let's vote. Okay, blah, blah, blah. So we delivered the result quite quickly. And I felt we were going to get good grades, let's say good feedback. Mm-hmm. These people who were organizing this course, these external psychologists and stuff. And they gave us a bit of a blasting. They said, oh no, it's all too easy. You guys are too complacent. It's just these things you had to choose between to make your decisions. You should have had a much more intense debate and higher level of tension in your group to decide, you shouldn't have just steamrolled through the easy solution, and you should have debated it far more. And at the tail of 2 championships, I felt, come on, what are these guys talking about? Then 2009 came, which was a very bad year for us. And I remember thinking that actually, and understanding a bit more what they were on about. I think it's not only people liking to work with each other, it's also challenging each other, and sometimes challenging each other sometimes comes with not liking each other, if you know what I mean. And what is the right balance between getting on and agreeing, or not getting on and disagreeing, or how do you mix both? I think is very much one of the difficulties.
I know it's one of these things that I must admit, I think when you're early on in your career, you do think, oh, this is a load of rubbish. This is all this we're talking about all this psychology stuff. But I don't know, at least I felt the more I've progressed through my career and seen, I have had more appreciation for the role of the culture you set and like how much level of disagreement or agreement you allow. And I think it can have more of an influence than people realize on sort of a...
Absolutely. And I remember in my early career, I'm going to speak ultimately very positively about 2 individuals I have huge respect for, and therefore I'm sure if they happen to listen to this, they disagree. I had my 2 bosses in my early career were Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne. And in my Benetton days, I remember I was thinking, Rory was the chief designer and he was basically creating the car, and Ross was a more managerial leadership type role. And in my Benetton days, I definitely, if you'd asked me who's actually responsible for the results, I would have 100% said Rory. And I still believe Rory had a massive input and was very, very good at what he was doing. So as years moved by, I realized actually that Ross had also an extremely important role of a different nature, when in my early years I really underestimated, and then I understood how important it was probably more after we moved to Ferrari, for example.
Yeah, I guess you needed, maybe also as well, you needed to be in a senior position yourself to fully appreciate, what others are, what others are doing. Did you ever, you've obviously been in Formula One now, I mean, essentially your whole career, and there does seem to be a trend that people stay in it. But I would imagine, has part of you ever, wanted to go off and do a startup in California on eVTOL or do something completely different? Do you still have the sort of bug for Formula One even to this day? Is it that strong within you?
I definitely have still got the bug. I wouldn't say it is a bug that prevails over everything else. I have seen quite a lot of people who've left and done startups or different things and are very happy and content with that. I also know quite a lot of people who have a better work-life balance than I have, and
I can imagine.
Therefore, I certainly wouldn't see it in as absolute a way now that I perhaps used to see it 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. But I still enjoy, and I feel it's very fortunate to be doing.
So maybe a kind of final question for you, or area, really about what you would advise to people. I know you must get asked this question so much, but I'll try and be more specific with it around getting into Formula One. Is there, first of all, the PhD route, I would call the becoming a specialist route. Would you advocate for that? Is that somewhere you would look for if you were sort of hiring people? And secondly, what about this balance between the F1 knowledge or the motorsport knowledge versus the science or the technology? It's often a question I get asked, like, should I do a motorsport degree? Should I do work experience in motorsport? Or is it more important to have the sort of science and the technical knowledge?
Okay, there's obviously more than one way to skin a cat. Now, I do get asked this a lot, and I do speak with young people who are in this phase of their studies quite a lot, and they ask me such questions. So what I say is my opinion. It's not the only way. I don't think a PhD is essential, and it's not. If you consider 3 years versus a master's of 1 year, does it vastly improve the chances? I would say probably not. I think a PhD has this degree of flexibility that if you happen to find a job in the right moment, you more easily jump ship and more easily move into your job without maybe completing your PhD, which is very unadvisable, but people would do that.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
I'm not. I think I prefer more generalists than specialists overall. I don't think it is essential to do a motorsport course. I think doing a general engineering or something like that is at least as good, and then what prevails in the choice is the quality of the university rather than whether the course is a specific motorsport course or not. What I do, however, recommend a lot to young people is I give them 2 bits of advice. One is, my opinion, of course, that if their university has a Formula SAE type activity, I think it is strongly advisable they do that. If they want to get in motorsport, of course, because doing it indicates that they work hard, they can work in a team, they have spent a huge amount of time doing that, as well as studying for their degree and getting their good grades. I was asked a question by one guy, what's more important, do Formula SAE or get good grades? Well, both.
That's very common in SAE because they get obsessed with it. So some students.
So I remember telling him, no, if you're going to do it and then have bad grades, actually then you're worse off. So you need to do both, and if you manage to do well in both, it means it gives a message to your employer that, look, you're a hard worker and so on. So definitely advise that. The other thing I advise is that the world is changing and we don't know what it will be like in 20, 30, 40 years from now. And people should always have a plan B as well. And make sure that what they study and what they do doesn't lead into only motorsport, but can lead into a variety of fields in motorsport. So I consider it's good luck to be in motorsport. I'm being extremely fortunate. I'm not sure if somebody who's now 20, who will be still working in 45 years from now, probably when he's 65, I'm not sure if he can rely on just motorsport being his breadwinner. So I think it's important for people to have a wide range of skills and abilities.
Yeah, it is that's really good advice, and what I find as well, and maybe it's because of what we spoke about right at the beginning, because there's so many people employed in these teams, and it's hard to progress, because I guess there's like a triangle, sort of structure, isn't it?
Yeah.
I usually say to people that, yes, be passionate about getting into F1, but it's also a great stepping stone. So many people have gone into F1 and become experts in there and then exported that into others. I think Formula One, one of its greatest exports is its talent. I know you often talk about technology, but I'd say it's more the people. If you look at Tesla and Rivian and all these sort of exciting companies, and you look at who's the person who's head of aero or chief designer, it's almost always someone from Formula One. It's kind of incredible. It has been a great exporter, hasn't it, in talent? Even if you don't make it in F1 or decide to leave, it's still a good stepping stone, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Really appreciate it. I know you're a busy man, and this probably on your first day back, there's about 1 million emails that are getting up.
Although I have to close with a mini boast. I think sometimes my biggest contribution to the sport, I think, was I believe I was the guy who initially originated the idea of the August break, and so thanks to that, I don't have 1 million emails, and I have only a relatively manageable list of emails to go through. But nonetheless, I'm trying to remember what it was all about. So.
That's a good thing, right? So people, whenever they're disappointed in the FIA's decision, they should thank you for actually giving them a nice break over August. Yeah,
and it was done for back in my pre-FIA days. I proposed it when I was at Ferrari. And I proposed it when I came back. I think I would have thought about it when I was flying back on a plane after a bad holiday, which was full of phone calls and emails and trying to manage between my little kids at that time and a phone call and the wind tunnel report. And I had a really lousy holiday. And I remember thinking, that's just stupid. We must try.
It was a good decision.
Okay.
Great. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Nice to see you again. And
cheers.
Keep in touch.
Thanks.